We have been talking about the prayer word, which naturally leads us into the next topic, which is distractions. I like to tell people when I teach contemplative meditation that actually there aren't any distractions. Now, they know I'm lying, but at the same time I'm telling the truth. Distractions are a part of this kind of prayer, even a necessary part. But they're not something to be overly concerned with. People often ask at the end of a workshop, do you ever get rid of distractions, or does it ever get better? And my usual answer is, no, you never get rid of them, but it does get better in the sense that you can be comfortable with them. You can know how to deal with them. You can be comfortable with them if you understand them and look at them according to the instructions that are given in the Cloud of Unknowing. In chapter 32, page 88, the author of the Cloud gives two methods or two techniques. And then, by the way, in the next chapter he says he doesn't have any techniques or methods. But he gives two methods or two techniques of dealing with distractions. Now, clearly, when you are doing lectio, when you are doing meditatio, when you are doing oratio, that is, in your spiritual reading, in your discursive meditation or prayer, distractions are a no-no. They come, they bother you, they take your mind away from what you're doing. You go off into a reverie. Now this also happens in contemplatio, in contemplative meditation, but here it's not a problem. In fact, it's a necessary part of the meditation. Now, I'm going to explain the reason for this later on, but right now I want to be practical and just look at the distractions themselves and see how to deal with them. And later on, I'll talk about their value and their meaning. The title of chapter 2, page 88 is Concerning Two Spiritual Devices Helpful to Beginners in Contemplation. And I think it's more than beginners that these devices are helpful with. The Cloud says, all the same, I will tell you a little about two techniques for handling distractions. Try them and improve on them if you can. Now, for years personally, I have dealt with the one technique, the first technique only. But now I'm getting more and more into the second one, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But the author of the Cloud goes on to say, when distracting thoughts annoy you, try to pretend that you do not even notice their presence or that they have come between you and your God. Look beyond them, over your shoulder as it were, as if you were looking for something else, which of course you are. For beyond them, God is hidden in the dark cloud of unknowing. Do this, and I feel sure that you will soon be relieved of any anxiety about them. And then he says, I can vouch for the orthodoxy of this technique because in reality it amounts to a yearning for God. Again, this is William of St. Thierry, and who says that this is love itself. This is the first level of love, the attraction for God. This is an expression of that looking around or beyond the distractions. The Cloud goes on, it amounts to a yearning for God, a longing to see and taste Him as much as possible in this life, and desire like this is actually love which always brings peace. So we are experiencing love as we look around, that is, over the shoulders of a distraction. Now the point is, when you don't do this, when you don't try to look around a distraction, what are you doing? Well, if you're not looking around it, you're staring it straight in the face. And when you look it straight in the face, it's equivalent to getting into the ring, putting on the gloves and boxing and fighting with it. In other words, you give it your undivided attention. You give all your energy to it. And this is not what you're supposed to do with a distraction. I remember some years ago when I was in Jordan and taking a guided tour through the ancient city of Petra. And we had to go through a long, narrow canyon to get to the city through a mountain pass sort of that actually was only maybe 8 or 9 feet wide. And to go through this, we went on horses. And they had Arab guides, one guide for each horse, leading us through this narrow passageway. And the guide told us before the tour that this was all paid for in the tour. So she said, don't, if they tell you it's $20 or whatever it is, don't give them anything because it's all taken care of. Now, what you have to know when you're dealing with these people in the Middle East is you not only have to bargain for whatever it is you're doing, the item you're buying or the services that's being performed, you've got to bargain for that. But then you also have to bargain for the tip, which is a totally independent procedure. And so you bargain for the ride, and then you bargain for the bakshish, the tip. Well, the guide said to us, well, look, this is all taken care of. So, and here's the advice she gave us. When you get off the horse and the guide goes up to you and he is going to insist on the bakshish, don't look him in the eye, just walk away. Now this was very interesting because there were some ladies with us. In fact, there was one in front of me and one behind. And I get off the horse, and sure enough, the guide came up and he put out his hand. He says, bakshish, bakshish. And I just looked over his shoulder and walked off. Now the lady in front of me couldn't do that, and she started giving him an argument. And she said, well, the guy told us this was all, and looking him in the eye. Well, she ended up giving him $10. I ended up giving him nothing, you see. The whole point was, when you look something directly in the eye, when you confront it directly, you're given to it, you're lost to it, you give your undivided attention to it, you see. And so this is what the cloud of unknowing means when he says, don't confront a distraction, but rather look over its shoulder. You see, you've done all the proper things. And you followed all the instructions that I've given you, all the instructions of the cloud, and you're sitting in your prayer chair, and you rip the phone off the wall, and you put a sign on the front door, get away, I'm loving God, and you sit down, and you say your opening prayer, and then you start offering the symbol, the word prayer, the act of love, Abba, Father, Abba, Father. Now you're doing this to yourself, of course. So you, Abba, Father, Abba, Father. I wonder if I took the beef stew out of the freezer. It's going to take about 2 hours for that to defrost. And do I have enough onions? Yeah, I got to get some onions. Have I got the carrot? Oh. Here I am, I'm supposed to be praying, I'm supposed to be loving God, and I'm thinking about making beef stew. Why do I do this? Why does something like this always come up in these sublime moments? Now you see what you've done. You've given yourself 100% to the distractions. If instead of excoriating yourself and saying, why am I doing this? Why do I always do this? Instead of looking it directly in the eye, supposing you said, I'm supposed to be praying. I will go back to my prayer. You see, you haven't honored the distraction at all. You looked over its shoulder indirectly and used it as an occasion to further intensify your love for God. You can have 500 distractions in 20 minutes, and that's a blessing. It really is. But watch out. If someone comes to me and says, "Oh, I'm exhausted. I had 632 distractions in 17 and a half minutes." I would reply, "Isn't that wonderful? You loved God and reaffirmed your love for God 632 times. That is great." You see, if you're dismayed by that, then the purity of your intention is very much suspect. Why are you doing this in the first place? Are you doing this so that you can love God for 20 minutes purely and without distractions? Is that your intention? Or are you doing this so that you can love God for 20 minutes? There's a difference, quite a difference there. You see, love begins when nothing is expected in return. And you don't do this meditation for any other reason than itself. I think, and I invite you to challenge this, that this kind of meditation, this loving God, is the only thing in your life that you do without an ulterior motive. Or any kind of genuine love is the only thing in your life that you do without an ulterior motive. It's the only thing you do for no other reason than itself. And you want to keep that in mind. We love God because we love God because God is worth loving. Now, this is the first method or technique that the cloud gives, and it's very simple. When you find that you have stopped your prayer, you simply go back to your prayer, regardless of the distraction. Now, the second method is one I'd like to emphasize this afternoon. Look again at chapter 32, the second paragraph. The author of the cloud says, "There is another strategy you are welcome to try also. When you feel utterly exhausted from fighting your thoughts, say to yourself, 'It's futile to contend with them any longer.' Then fall down before them like a captive or a coward." Now, for me, this is what works. I simply give up. I simply surrender. I've had it. Then, as the cloud says, in doing this, you commend yourself to God in the midst of your enemies and admit the radical impotence of your nature. I advise you to remember this device particularly, for in employing it, you make yourselves completely supple in God's hands. And surely when this attitude is authentic, it is the same as self-knowledge, because you have seen yourself as you really are, a miserable and defiled creature, less than nothing without God. That's a statement, by the way, that has to be taken with my warning against worm theology. This is indeed experiential humility. When God beholds you standing alone in this truth, He cannot refrain from hastening to you and revenging Himself on your enemies. Then, like a father rescuing his small child from the jaws of wild swine or savage bears, He will stoop to you and, gathering you in His arms, tenderly brush away your spiritual tears. Now, this is very beautiful, and it's also very practical. As the author of The Cloud says about the first technique, he says, I can vouch for the orthodoxy of this technique. In other words, he's saying it really works. Well, I can vouch for the orthodoxy of the second technique. It really works. And to me, it's a marvelous experience. You know what it reminds me of? Therese of Lisieux talks about the very same idea. She sees herself or describes herself as a young child, a very young child, maybe a year old, and she's at the bottom of a flight of stairs, and she's looking up at her father, who is standing at the top of the stairs, and she wants to get up to her father. Now, she has to start. If she turns around and crawls away and gives up, it's all over. But she has to try, even though she knows she can't do it. And as she tries to climb the first stair in vain, of course, what her father does is he runs down the stairs, sweeps her up in his arms, and carries her to the top. Now, there's the same idea here, and even a similar imagery in terms of distractions. And again, if you want to look to in chapter 7, page 55, the author says, "Dispel your thoughts by turning to Jesus with loving desire." In other words, by loving, which is what you're doing in the first place. We've been talking about the prayer word, and now I would like to talk about the prayer word in relation to distraction, because that's part of its function, and this is really, in a sense, a third technique that the cloud gives us. In chapter 7, page 56, the last paragraph, about the 7th line, the author says, "Use this word to beat upon the cloud of darkness above you and to subdue all distractions." So we're using the word, the prayer word, to subdue distractions, he says. And again he says, "Consigning these distractions to the cloud of forgetting beneath you. Should some thought go on annoying you, demanding to know what you are doing, answer with this one word alone." And also in chapter 26, page 83, in the second paragraph, he says, "Why is this work so toilsome?" Now, remember, you've got to take everything he says in the context of the book, because at some times, as he reminds us, this work is not toilsome. "The labor, of course, is in the unrelenting struggle to banish the countless distracting thoughts that plague our minds and to restrain them beneath that cloud of forgetting which I spoke of earlier. This is the suffering. All the struggle is on man's side," again, excuse the chauvinistic language, but it's here, "in the effort he must make to prepare himself for God's action, which is the awakening of love and which God alone can do." Again, I get the picture of this child trying to climb the stairs and the father running down and picking the child up. And that, you see, is God's response to us when we do this. And what I'd like to look at now for a moment is something that I find is very consoling. And the author of The Cloud says, speaking about falling asleep during this work of love. He deals with this in other works, particularly in the Epistle Privy Counseling. But in relation to sleep, he says, "If you should fall asleep in this work of love, thank God." Last spring, when I was leaving Israel and coming back to the United States, I went by way of France, and I took the opportunity of visiting some of our roots, that is, the monasteries in France that are responsible for the foundation of the order. And the first place I visited was our mother house in Citeaux, whence we get the name Cistercians. And I gave a talk there. And in this talk on the cloud, I mentioned this admonition of the cloud, that if you fall asleep during this work of love, thank God. Well, the monks loved this. They were very appreciative of it, and they thought it was great. Now, my plans were that after I left Citeaux, I was going to go to the other monastery whence we also get our nickname Trappist. I was going to visit Le Grand Trappe, which is not too far from Paris. However, I had a commitment first to go to Geneva, and I gave a contemplative prayer workshop there to a group of a nice group of people, by the way, from all over the world, about 250 people from the United Nations. And this took 5 days, so I was gone almost a full week from the time I spoke to the monks at Citeaux to the time that I got to the monastery at Le Grand Trappe. Well, I went into the chapter room with the prior, and he introduced me to the monks. And I didn't get the full introduction because he spoke French rather quickly with an accent that I wasn't that familiar with. And all I heard was, voici l'Américain, and this is the American. And I didn't really get the next line. However, the monks stood up and started applauding. And I said to myself, well, gee, this is wonderful. They really make you feel right at home. So I gave them a talk. This one wasn't a talk on the cloud. And afterwards, I said to the prior, what did you tell them that got that response? Well, it seems that when I left Citeaux and went to Geneva during that week I was absent, Citeaux had published her monthly newsletter. And in the newsletter, they mentioned what I had said about falling asleep during this meditation. So when the prior introduced me to the monks at La Trappe, he said, this is the American who says it's all right to go to sleep when you pray. So that's okay. Now, I'm going to explain why this is so, why it is all right. The author is not being facetious, and he's not really trying to be humorous. And there's a very solid psychological and theological reasoning behind both distractions and falling asleep. And I would take this admonition quite literally. And it's almost like Rule 3b. When you fall asleep during this work of love, thank God. I do this literally, and I do fall asleep literally. And I wake up and I say, thank you, Lord, I will go back to my prayer. It's a very legitimate approach. And I refer you also now to chapter 7 in the Cloud regarding distractions that you can read on your own. What I would like to look at now briefly is the epistemology of the Cloud. In addition to the references that I'm going to give you, you might put down a note to see chapter 64 for some more information on this. But don't be frightened of that word. What do I mean by an epistemology? An epistemology is simply an examination of the workings of the mind. How does the mind work? When you try to answer that question, you are giving an epistemology. Okay? And it's very interesting because different philosophies have different epistemologies. It's almost like in science, where you have the principle of uncertainty coming from the understanding of whether light is a series of particles or whether it's a wave, whether it's ungular. Now, we don't know which it is, as a matter of fact. And the answer to that question, is light particles or is it ungular? The answer is yes. In other words, scientists, if they want to work with light as particles and include the concept of light as particles, it works. If they want to use light as ungular, as waves, and in their theories of light, if they do it this way, it works. And that's all they can say, it works. Now, I think that in epistemology, and I don't care what epistemology it is, whether it's Freud or Jung or Skinner or transactional analysis or whatever, it doesn't really matter. All of them are simply descriptions from different points of view, and probably no one is more true than another. Now, the scholastic epistemology that I am mostly trained in, and that from which the Cloud proceeds, is not very popular today, but it doesn't make any difference. It's easy to explain, and it works when you apply it to contemplative prayer, and therefore it is of value. No epistemology can ever possibly be proven as true to the exclusion of what others say, because any explanation of the mind is simply a description of what someone sees the mind doing and an attempt to explain how it's done and an interpretation of it according to whatever the philosophy or the theology of the doer is into. So we have then to talk a little bit about scholastic epistemology. That is, the epistemology that belongs to the 13th century and is related both to Plato and Aristotle, but perhaps a little more to Aristotle than to Plato as interpreted by St. Augustine. Now, particularly we're concerned with the Aristotelian as interpreted by St. Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, and so forth. Now, what's the understanding of the mind according to the cloud of unknowing? Basically, the mind is the entire head, if you want. And it's divided, according to the scholastics, into 4 compartments. One is the intellect, one is the will, one is the imagination, and the other is the feelings. Now, altogether, these are called the mind. Be careful now, because by mind, I don't mean what we usually mean when we talk of the mind. I want to talk about particularly the intellect and the will. Now, these are called by the cloud of unknowing the primary faculties. Your intelligence, your thinking process, and your will, which is your choosing, judging, loving process. These are what I want to be concerned with. Loving belongs to the will. Thinking belongs to the intellect. Now, the intellect is finite. It's limited because we are finite and we are limited. The intellect is drawn to the truth. It's drawn like a magnet is drawn to iron. Your intellect, your intelligence, is attracted to the truth, and it cannot do anything about it. It can be deceived, but it has to go with what is true, or that is what it judges to be true. Now, I can prove this to you very simply. 2 and 2 is 4. Now, you don't have any freedom about that at all. You may pretend to deny it, but you cannot really deny it. You have to accept it. It's an obvious truth, and your intellect, which is oriented towards the truth, has to receive this truth. Your intellect is drawn to what is true. Now, the truth, of course, gets more and more complicated. And your will, however, is not drawn to the truth precisely, but it is drawn to the truth insofar as the truth is good. You remember the old Latin, those who remember their Latin, omniens est unum bonum et verum. All being is one, true, and good. So if something is true, it is by that very nature also good. So if something then attracts the intellect because it is true, by that very fact, the will will attract it because it is good. So anything that is true is therefore good. I hope that's not too complicated. It's a simple principle. So the intellect is drawn to a thing as true, whereas the will is drawn to the same thing, the true thing, but not as true, but as good. Just like a magnet is drawn to iron, the will is not free to reject what is good. Now, here's the problem. The will is blind. When we say love is blind, love is the love. It's the will which loves. We say, and the will depends upon the intellect, because it's blind, to present its truth so that the will can reach up and then love that truth as good. I hope that's clear. I'm going to make it clearer in a moment. The function of the intellect is to be the eyes for the blind will. The intellect sees something and says, aha, this is true, and therefore embraces the truth because it can't do anything else. But once it embraces the truth, it then goes to the will and says, will, here is a truth. And the will says, no, no, it's not a truth, it's a good. And the will, depending on the eye of the intellect, reaches out, and just as the intellect had to accept that truth, the will has to accept the good, which is the same thing. This is the way it works according to the scholastic explanation. Now, I was teaching this to a group of people from the foreign embassies in Tel Aviv, and about 2 years ago, and I used a little example that I'll show you in the next session to describe this philosophical principle. And one of the women said to me, well, Father, will you write that down for us? That was very helpful, the example that you used. So when they left, I went to my cell and I started writing it down. And 4 months later, I was still writing it down. What I actually was led to do was to go to the chapters of the Cloud where he talks about the intellect and the will, and then to rewrite them according to my little example, my imagery that I'll tell you about later. And what I actually ended up doing, of course, is I rewrote the entire Cloud of Unknowing. I sat down and I said, what would I do today if I were the author of the Cloud of Unknowing and writing it, say, in Colorado for people of the 20th century? How would I do it? And I didn't quote the Cloud once. I simply took each chapter, and you know how the Cloud is divided into 74 very small chapters. I took each chapter and each chapter heading, and I asked, well, what is the message of this chapter? And how will I express this message in the American modern idiom? And then I rewrote the chapter. And I did this for the entire book. Now, I've been talking about the Cloud of Unknowing for some 20 years, and I've given literally hundreds of workshops on contemplative prayer based on the Cloud of Unknowing. And I try to, and I'm usually somewhat successful in getting people enthused about the Cloud. And so what they do, of course, is they go off and buy it. And fortunately, you can get it for $5 in the Johnston's edition, which is not expensive for a book. But then, much to my disappointment, so often when I see these people later on, and they say to me, well, I gave up on it, or I didn't finish it, or it was too difficult for me. What I ended up doing then, at least I think I ended up doing this, was rewriting the Cloud of Unknowing in a way that it can be understood by the modern reader, especially one not trained in scholastic philosophy. And just as a word of advertising here, the book is going to be published in the early fall by Continuum Press in New York under the title, The Loving Search for God. Well, let's take a few-minute break, and when we come back, I would like to explain the intellect and the will according to the analogy or the image that I used for this book.